The bright afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling estate, where lush gardens and manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see. The scene was idyllic, a perfect backdrop for the annual charity gala hosted by one of the wealthiest men in the country. The event, held in the grandeur of his own mansion, was the talk of the town every year. The who's who of society gathered here, dressed in their finest attire, ready to contribute generously to a noble cause. This was the place where power met philanthropy, where the elite mingled, and where stories were born. Stories that often remained untold as the guests arrived. They were greeted by the sounds of a live orchestra playing softly in the background, setting the tone for an evening of elegance and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers hung from tall ceilings, sparkling as they caught the light, and tables were adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, offering glasses of champagne and delicately prepared hors d'oeuvres. Conversations flowed, punctuated by laughter and the occasional clink of glasses. The atmosphere was one of celebration, a testament to the success and status of those present. Among the guests was a man who was no stranger to such events. He was known not only for his immense wealth, but also for his striking presence. Tall, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, he commanded attention wherever he went. His name was Alexander Gray, a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. He was a figure both admired and envied, a man whose business acumen was matched only by his enigmatic persona. Despite his wealth, Alexander was a man of few words, often preferring to observe rather than engage in the endless chatter that surrounded him. On this particular afternoon, however, something was different. As he stood by the edge of the garden, taking in the view and the bustling activity around him, he felt a sense of unease. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, a nagging sensation that something was about to disrupt the carefully curated harmony of the event. Little did he know that this unease would soon be realized in the most unexpected way. As the guests continued to arrive, a small figure caught Alexander's attention. She was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, dressed in a simple, yet elegant, white dress. Her hair, a cascade of golden curls, framed her cherubic face, and her bright green eyes sparkled with curiosity as she navigated through the crowd. There was something about her that stood out amidst the sea of opulence, a certain innocence, a purity that was rare in such a setting. The girl moved with a purpose, her gaze focused intently on something, or someone, in the distance. As she weaved her way through the throngs of adults, she was careful not to bump into anyone, her small feet barely making a sound on the polished marble floor. She seemed to be searching for something, her tiny hands clutching the hem of her dress nervously. Alexander watched her with a mix of curiosity and concern. What was a child doing at an event like this? He hadn't seen her before, and she certainly didn't seem to belong to any of the guests he recognized. Yet, there she was, moving determinedly through the crowd, oblivious to the grandeur around her. As she approached the spot where Alexander stood, the girl suddenly stopped. She looked up at him, her green eyes wide with recognition. For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Alexander felt a strange sense of familiarity wash over him, though he was certain he had never seen this child before. Before he could say anything, the girl spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that belied her years. "I know you," she said, her words clear and direct. Alexander was taken aback. He knelt down to her level, a puzzled expression on his face. "You know me?" he asked gently, trying to understand where this was coming from. The girl nodded, her curls bouncing with the movement. "Yes, I know you. Your picture is in my daddy's wallet." Her statement hung in the air between them, unexpected and bewildering. Alexander felt a jolt of surprise, followed by a wave of confusion. How could his picture be in her father's wallet? Who was her father, and why would he carry a photo of Alexander Gray? As these questions raced through his mind, Alexander found himself struggling to maintain his composure. The girl's innocent remark had thrown him off balance, leaving him with more questions than answers. He was a man used to being in control, to understanding every situation he found himself in. But now, faced with this tiny stranger and her cryptic words, He felt a sense of vulnerability that was entirely foreign to him. He studied the girl's face, searching for some clue, some indication of who she might be or how she knew him. But there was nothing, just the same innocent curiosity in her eyes, the same unwavering gaze that told him she was speaking the truth as she knew it. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Emma," the girl replied without hesitation. "And your daddy? What's his name?" Emma paused, as if considering whether she should reveal this information. Then, with the candid honesty that only a child could possess, she answered, "My daddy's name is David. David Carter." The name meant nothing to Alexander. It wasn't a name he recognized, at least not immediately. He ran through the mental list of people he had met, business associates, acquaintances from various walks of life, but no one named David Carter came to mind. Yet, here was his daughter, standing before him, telling him that his picture was in her father's wallet. "David Carter," Alexander repeated, trying to place the name. "Do you know why your daddy has my picture?" Emma shook her head, her expression serious. "No, but he looks at it sometimes. He says you're someone important." Alexander's thoughts raced as he tried to piece together this strange puzzle. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about this encounter, something that went beyond a simple case of mistaken identity or an odd coincidence. But what? As he knelt there, face to face with this little girl, Alexander realized that he needed to find out more. He needed to understand how his life had intersected with that of David Carter and why this man, a stranger to him, would carry his photo. "Emma," he said, choosing his words carefully, "do you know where your daddy is right now?" Emma looked around the garden, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "He's over there," she said, pointing toward the far end of the lawn, where a group of men stood talking. Alexander followed her gaze, trying to spot the man she was referring to. But from this distance, it was impossible to tell which of the figures might be David Carter. He needed to get closer, to see this man for himself. "Would you take me to him?" Alexander asked, his curiosity now fully piqued. Emma nodded, her face lighting up with a smile. "Okay," she said, taking his hand in her small one. Together, they made their way through the crowd, Emma leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Alexander felt a strange sense of anticipation building inside him, a feeling that something important was about to happen. He didn't know what he would find when they reached Emma's father, but he knew that this encounter was not something he could ignore. As they walked, Alexander couldn't help but wonder about the events that had led to this moment. What was it that connected him to David Carter? Was it a business deal from years ago? Some forgotten encounter that had left a lasting impression on the man? Or was it something more personal, something that Alexander had yet to discover? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. He was a man who had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to unravel even the most complex mysteries. But this was something different. This was a mystery that touched on the very essence of who he was, and he couldn't rest until he had the answers. As they neared the group of men, Alexander felt his heart rate quicken. The anticipation, the uncertainty, it was all building to a crescendo. He scanned the faces of the men, searching for any sign of recognition, any hint of familiarity. And then, as Emma tugged on his hand, pulling him toward one of the men, Alexander felt a jolt of recognition. There, standing with his back to them, was a man in his late 30s, his dark hair peppered with gray. He was dressed in a simple, yet well-tailored suit, a stark contrast to the more flamboyant outfits of the other guests. There was something unassuming about him, something that made him blend into the background, almost as if he didn't quite belong in this world of wealth and privilege. Emma let go of Alexander's hand and ran toward the man, her face lighting up with joy. "Daddy!" she called out, her voice filled with excitement. The man turned at the sound of her voice, his expression softening as he saw his daughter running toward him. He bent down to scoop her up into his arms, his face breaking into a smile that was both warm and genuine. For a moment, Alexander just stood there, watching the scene unfold before him. There was something about the man's demeanor, the way he held his daughter, that struck a chord within him. It was a simple moment, a moment of pure, unfiltered love between a father and his child. And yet, it was in that moment that Alexander felt the weight of the mystery that had brought him here. As the man straightened up, still holding Emma in his arms, he finally noticed Alexander standing a few feet away. Their eyes met, and for a brief second, time seemed to stand still. There was a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes, followed by a look of surprise. "Mr. Gray," the man said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I didn't expect to see you here." Alexander nodded, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. "David Carter, I presume?" he replied, his tone measured. David set Emma down gently, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "Yes, that's right," he said. "I'm David Carter." There was a pause, a moment of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Both men stood there, facing each other, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. Alexander could see the same confusion in David's eyes, the same sense of uncertainty that he himself was feeling. Finally, it was Alexander who broke the silence. "Your daughter," he began. "She told me that you have a photo of me in your wallet. I don't understand. Why would you have my picture?" David's expression softened as he looked down at Emma, who was now playing with a flower she had picked from the garden. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as if trying to find the right words. "It's not something I expected to talk about today," David said slowly, "but I suppose I owe you an explanation." Alexander waited, his curiosity now fully engaged. He had come this far. He needed to know the truth. David glanced around, as if to make sure they were out of earshot of the other guests. Then, he looked Alexander in the eye and said, "It's a long story, Mr. Gray, but if you're willing to listen, I think it's time you knew the whole truth." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever this was, whatever connection existed between him and David Carter, it was something that had the power to change everything. And as David began to speak, Alexander knew that his life was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. The moment those words left Emma's lips, Alexander Gray felt the world around him begin to tilt. It was as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly become unsteady, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't have control over the situation. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady, insistent drumbeat that he could hear in his ears as he tried to process what the little girl had just said. "I know you. Your picture is in my daddy's wallet." The simplicity of the statement was what made it so jarring. In the grand ballroom, filled with the city's most influential figures, where the only concerns were which hors d'oeuvres to sample next and how much to bid in the upcoming auction, these words felt out of place, like a discordant note in a perfectly composed symphony. Alexander wasn't sure how to respond. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, each one more perplexing than the last. How was it possible that this child, this little girl he had never seen before, knew him? And more disturbingly, why was his picture in her father's wallet? The crowd around them continued to move, unaware of the bizarre exchange taking place. The soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the lilting notes of the orchestra played on as if nothing had happened. Yet, in Alexander's mind, everything had shifted. He stared at Emma, her wide green eyes brimming with innocence, as if she held the key to a mystery he hadn't even known existed. For a man like Alexander, whose life had been built on precision, strategy, and an unwavering sense of control, the unexpected was something to be managed, not experienced. He had spent years cultivating an image of impenetrability, a fortress of success and composure that no one could breach. Yet, here he was, feeling as though the walls he had so carefully constructed were beginning to crack. And all because of a few words spoken by a child. "Your picture is in my daddy's wallet." Alexander had never been one to indulge in sentimentality. His focus had always been on the future, on what he could build, achieve, and conquer. The past was something he rarely dwelled on. It was a place he preferred to leave behind, locked away in the recesses of his mind. But now, the past seemed to be reaching out to him, through the innocent voice of a child who had no idea of the turmoil she had just unleashed. He wanted to ask her more, to understand the meaning behind her words, but his voice seemed to fail him. Instead, he simply stood there, staring at Emma, his mind racing through possibilities. Was it a mistake? Could she have confused him with someone else? But as he looked into her earnest eyes, he knew that wasn't the case. There was no doubt in her mind that she was telling the truth as she knew it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alexander found his voice. It was steadier than he felt, though there was an edge to it that betrayed his inner turmoil. "Emma," he began, choosing his words carefully, "are you sure it's me you're talking about?" The little girl nodded confidently. "Yes, I'm sure. Daddy has your picture in his wallet. I've seen it lots of times." The conviction in her voice left no room for doubt. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't a man prone to fear, but there was something about this situation that unnerved him in a way he hadn't felt in years. He tried to think logically. Perhaps her father had met him once, at some event or meeting, and had kept a photograph as a memento. But that didn't make sense. Alexander was a public figure, yes, but he wasn't in the habit of giving out personal photos. And why would a man carry his picture in his wallet? The idea was absurd, yet here he was, faced with a child who was adamant that this was the case. "Do you know why your daddy has my picture?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his tone light, though his curiosity was burning. Emma shook her head, her curls bouncing with the movement. "No, but he looks at it sometimes. He says you're important." Important. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Alexander didn't know what to make of it. In his world, importance was measured in influence, power, and wealth. But what did it mean to this little girl? And what did it mean to her father? Before he could ask more, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was David Carter, Emma's father, who had been speaking with another group of guests nearby. He had noticed his daughter talking to Alexander and had made his way over, curiosity etched on his face. "Emma, what are you up to?" David asked, his tone warm but laced with mild concern. Emma turned to him with a bright smile. "Daddy, this is the man from your wallet. I told him about the picture." David's face changed in an instant. The color drained from his cheeks, and his eyes widened in shock. He looked from Emma to Alexander, then back to Emma, as if trying to comprehend what his daughter had just said. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his composure completely shattered. Alexander, who had been watching this reaction closely, felt a strange sense of satisfaction mingled with his own unease. He wasn't the only one caught off guard by this revelation. "Emma," David began, his voice strained, "why don't you go find your mother? I need to speak with Mr. Gray for a moment." The little girl pouted, clearly unhappy at being dismissed, but she nodded obediently and skipped off into the crowd. As soon as she was out of earshot, David turned to Alexander, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and anxiety. "Mr. Gray, I apologize for my daughter. She has a vivid imagination, and sometimes she says things without thinking." But Alexander wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. There was something going on here, and he intended to find out what it was. "Mr. Carter," Alexander said, his voice calm but firm, "your daughter just told me that you have a photograph of me in your wallet. I'd like to know why." David's reaction was telling. He flinched as if the words had physically struck him, and he immediately began to stammer. "It's not what you think, I swear. There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for it." "I'm listening," Alexander replied, folding his arms across his chest. He was no longer just curious. He was determined to get to the bottom of this. David hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. He looked around nervously, as if hoping to find a way out of the conversation, but Alexander's gaze pinned him in place. There was no escape. "Mr. Gray," David began again, this time with a resigned sigh. "I know this must seem strange, but I assure you, it's not what it appears to be. The photograph, it's from a long time ago." "A long time ago?" Alexander repeated, his tone incredulous. "And why would you have kept it all these years?" David swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "It's complicated. I don't know how much you remember about your past, but there was a time when our paths crossed, briefly, but significantly." Alexander's mind raced as he tried to recall any memory of David Carter, but nothing came to mind. The man before him seemed utterly ordinary, unremarkable in every way. Yet, The way David spoke suggested that there was more to this story than Alexander had anticipated. "I don't recall meeting you before today," Alexander said, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you enlighten me?" David took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. "Mr. Gray, you probably don't remember me, but I remember you. You helped me many years ago, when I was in a very dark place. I was just a young man back then, struggling to make ends meet, with no idea what the future held. You changed the course of my life." Alexander frowned, searching his memory for any recollection of such an encounter. He had helped many people over the years, whether through charitable donations, business deals, or simple acts of kindness, but nothing about David Carter rang a bell. "How exactly did I help you?" Alexander asked, his tone skeptical. David hesitated again, clearly reluctant to delve into the details. "You probably don't even remember, but there was a time when I was working as a janitor in one of the buildings your company owned. It was a dead-end job, and I was barely scraping by. But one day, you noticed me. You saw me struggling, and you gave me an opportunity. You offered me a small loan, no questions asked, and told me to make something of myself." Alexander's brow furrowed. It sounded like something he might have done, but it was so far removed from his current reality that it felt like a story from another lifetime. He had once been more hands-on, more involved in the lives of the people who worked for him, but as his empire grew, he had distanced himself from those personal connections. "I see," Alexander said slowly, processing this information. "And what did you do with the money?" David smiled, though it was a smile tinged with bittersweet memories. "I used it to start my own business, a small repair shop. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And from there, I worked my way up, slowly but surely. That shop grew into something bigger, and eventually, I was able to build a life for myself and my family." "And you kept my photograph all these years?" Alexander asked, still trying to grasp the significance of this revelation. "Yes," David admitted, his voice softening. "It was a reminder of the man who saw something in me when no one else did. It was a reminder that one small act of kindness can change the course of a life. I kept it in my wallet because it reminded me to never forget where I came from, to always strive to be better, and to help others the way you helped me." For a moment, Alexander was silent. He had expected something else, something more sinister, perhaps, but this was entirely unexpected. He was a man used to wielding power, to making deals that changed the landscape of industries. But this was different. It was humbling in a way he hadn't anticipated. The idea that a single gesture, one he barely remembered, could have had such a profound impact on another person's life was both uplifting and disorienting. "I don't know what to say," Alexander finally admitted, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "You don't have to say anything," David replied. "I just wanted you to know that you made a difference. And I wanted to thank you for everything. I wouldn't be where I am today without your help." Alexander looked at David, seeing him in a new light. This man, who had once been a struggling janitor, had built a life for himself against all odds. And in some small way, Alexander had played a part in that. It was a sobering thought, one that made him reconsider the power of his actions, both past and present. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. Then, without another word, David extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Gray," he said simply. Alexander hesitated only a moment before taking David's hand in his own. The handshake was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them all those years ago. A bond that had persisted, even though Alexander had been unaware of it. As they released each other's hands, Alexander felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of renewal. The past, it seemed, was never truly gone. It lived on in the lives of those we touched, in ways we could never fully understand. And perhaps that was the true measure of a man's worth, not in the wealth he accumulated, but in the lives he changed along the way. As the evening continued around them, Alexander and David went their separate ways, but the impact of their conversation lingered. Alexander couldn't help but think about what Emma had said, about being important. It was a word that had taken on new meaning for him. And as he moved through the crowd, the weight of his responsibility, not just as a businessman, but as a human being, settled on his shoulders. The night was far from over, but Alexander knew that he would leave this event with more than just business cards and new connections. He would leave with a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that in the grand scheme of life, it's the small, often unnoticed moments that leave the most lasting impact. As he glanced back at David one last time, Alexander felt something shift within him. The encounter had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, something that, in the pursuit of success, had been buried beneath layers of ambition and drive. It was the simple truth that everyone, no matter how seemingly insignificant, has the power to change a life. And in doing so, they can change the world. And so, with a new resolve, Alexander Gray left the charity gala that night, not as the billionaire mogul he had been when he arrived, but as a man reminded of the importance of compassion, of kindness, and of the undeniable impact that one person can have on another. The story of Alexander Gray and David Carter was far from over, but that night, it found a new beginning, a beginning that would carry them both forward into the future, forever connected by the threads of a past that neither could have predicted, but both would forever cherish. The grand ballroom of the city's most opulent hotel was a realm of splendor that seemed to defy the ordinary bounds of human imagination. Crystal chandeliers hung like celestial constellations from the high, vaulted ceiling, their prisms scattering a soft, golden light across the room. Every surface gleamed with the polished sheen of wealth, from the marble floors to the meticulously arranged floral displays that added a touch of nature's elegance to the extravagance of the evening. The charity gala was in full swing, and the atmosphere buzzed with the hum of high society mingling and exchanging pleasantries. Guests in their finest attire, tuxedos, evening gowns, and shimmering jewels, moved gracefully across the room, their laughter and conversation melding into a symphony of social engagement. The event was a showcase of both grandeur and purpose, designed to raise funds for a cause that touched many lives. Alexander Gray, a prominent billionaire known for his influential presence in the business world, was among the distinguished attendees. Tonight, however, he was not the picture of effortless confidence that usually defined him at such events. The recent encounter with David Carter and the profound emotional revelations had left him introspective, causing him to view the gala through a different lens. He stood near the bar, a solitary figure amidst the swirling crowd, his gaze occasionally drifting to the lively interactions around him. Alexander's usual ease with such social gatherings seemed absent, replaced by a contemplative demeanor. He wore a sharply tailored black suit and a crisp white shirt, but tonight, his attire felt more like a uniform than a statement of success. The weight of his thoughts, stirred by the recent revelations, seemed to contrast sharply with the glamour and excitement of the gala. The evening progressed with its scheduled events: a sumptuous dinner, stirring speeches from notable figures, and a live band playing classic melodies that echoed through the room. Despite the extravagance and the warm buzz of the gala, Alexander found himself detached, lost in the reverie of his thoughts. The grandeur around him seemed almost like a distant backdrop to his internal narrative, which had been profoundly altered by the simple, yet powerful, story of David Carter and his family. As Alexander was absorbed in his reflections, the event took a turn that would further challenge his perspective. Emma Carter, the young girl from the story, approached him. Her presence was striking in its contrast to the opulent surroundings. Emma, dressed in a charming, modest dress that highlighted her youth and innocence, seemed almost out of place yet remarkably fitting within this world of sophistication. Mr. Gray, Emma's voice, though soft, carried a clarity that cut through the ambient noise of the gala. She looked up at him with earnest eyes, the kind that held stories far beyond her years. Alexander, momentarily startled, turned to face her. His expression softened as he saw her approach, her small frame brimming with a mix of confidence and youthful curiosity. "Emma," he greeted, trying to mask his surprise with a warm smile. Emma's father, David Carter, stood a few steps behind her, his own demeanor a blend of nervousness and pride. David's eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and trepidation as he watched the interaction unfold. The weight of the moment was palpable, as if the grandeur of the gala had momentarily receded to make way for a more personal and poignant exchange. Emma spoke again, her voice steady and filled with a sincerity that was both refreshing and humbling. I wanted to talk to you about something important. Last night, when I mentioned that I knew you because of the picture in Daddy's wallet, it wasn't just a random fact. That picture represents a significant part of our lives. It's a reminder of how your kindness had a meaningful impact on our family. The simple clarity of Emma's words cut through the haze of Alexander's contemplation. It was one thing to hear David's story recounted in a broad sense, but hearing it from Emma with such heartfelt emphasis provided a new layer of depth. The photograph she referred to wasn't merely a snapshot. It was a symbol of the ripple effects of Alexander's actions, a testament to the unseen yet profound consequences of his past generosity. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. The emotional gravity of the situation was heightened by Emma's innocent yet profound articulation. He realized that his understanding of his influence was not just academic but deeply personal, affecting real lives in ways he had never fully grasped. "Emma," Alexander said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I had no idea how much that small act of help had meant. Hearing it from you, seeing the impact it had on your family, it's truly eye-opening." Emma nodded solemnly, her gaze unwavering. "Daddy always said that you helped us when we needed it the most. And now, we're here to tell you that you've always been important to us, even if you didn't know it." David stepped forward, his voice steady yet filled with deep appreciation. "Mr. Gray, I can't thank you enough. What you did for us changed our lives in ways I could never have anticipated. Emma and I will always be grateful." The exchange was powerful, resonating with a sense of connection and mutual respect. For Alexander, it was a moment of profound realization. The gala, which had been a stage for social maneuvering and grand displays, had transformed into a space for genuine human connection. The impact of his past actions, as highlighted by David and Emma's words, brought a new dimension to his understanding of success and influence. The evening continued with its scheduled festivities, but for Alexander, the essence of the gala had shifted. The grandeur of the event was now seen through the lens of the personal and emotional connections that had been forged. He was no longer just a participant in a high-profile social event. He was a man confronted with the real-life implications of his past actions, a realization that would forever alter his perspective on both his personal and professional life. As the night wore on, Alexander felt a deep sense of transformation. The interactions with David and Emma had provided him with a new understanding of the impact of his actions. The lavish surroundings of the gala were juxtaposed with the profound personal revelations that had come to light, creating a complex yet beautiful tapestry of human connection and understanding. In this moment of reflection, surrounded by the opulence of the charity gala and the genuine gratitude of those he had touched, Alexander Gray faced a pivotal point in his journey. The evening had not only been a showcase of wealth and influence, but also a profound reminder of the true essence of success and the importance of empathy and kindness. Alexander Gray was accustomed to control. He commanded boardrooms, directed multi-billion-dollar ventures, and navigated the complex web of high society with the precision of a master tactician. But nothing in his meticulously curated life had prepared him for the surge of emotions and questions that had arisen from a seemingly innocuous statement by a child. The previous evening, after the unsettling encounter with David Carter and his daughter Emma, Alexander had tried to keep his composure. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, he was deeply unsettled. He had been trying to dismiss the incident as a mere coincidence, a peculiar but inconsequential blip in an otherwise predictable life. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt a gnawing sense of incompleteness, an urge to uncover the full story behind David Carter's connection to him. The next morning, after a sleepless night filled with restless tossing and turning, Alexander was resolute. He had to find answers, no matter where they led. After a brief meeting with his assistant to clear his schedule for the day, he decided to take a more personal approach rather than relying solely on his team's research skills. There were things in life that required a personal touch, and this was one of them. He drove himself to the address David Carter had given him, an old part of town where the streets seemed to have stories etched into every brick and cobblestone. The area was a far cry from the sleek skyscrapers and opulent surroundings Alexander was accustomed to. It had a certain charm, a timeless quality that seemed both comforting and alien to him. The drive was a contemplative one. As he navigated the narrow streets, he couldn't help but reflect on how little he knew about his own impact on the world. His life had been defined by achievement and success, yet here he was, on a quest driven by a child's innocent words and a man's emotional confession. It was a journey into the past, into the realm of personal connections he had largely avoided. The address led him to a modest brick building, its faded paint and slightly overgrown garden speaking of years gone by. Alexander parked his car and took a deep breath before stepping out. The contrast between this humble location and his own lavish lifestyle couldn't have been starker. Yet, there was something intriguing about it, a sense that the answers he sought were hidden in this very place. He approached the front door and rang the bell, the sound echoing through the quiet street. Moments later, David Carter appeared, his face a mixture of surprise and apprehension. He looked as though he had been expecting a visit, yet was unprepared for the reality of it. "Mr. Gray," David greeted, forcing a smile. "I wasn't sure if you would actually come." "I needed to," Alexander replied, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "May I come in?" David hesitated for a split second before stepping aside to let Alexander enter. The interior of the house was modest but warm. Family photos adorned the walls, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, adding an unexpected touch of homeliness to the otherwise straightforward decor. David led Alexander into a cozy living room, where the furniture was simple but well cared for. They both settled into armchairs, and David offered Alexander a cup of coffee, which he declined. His mind was too focused to appreciate the comfort of the gesture. "Mr. Carter," Alexander began, his tone more direct than before, "I need to understand more about why you had my picture in your wallet. Last night, you mentioned something about how I helped you years ago. I'm having trouble recalling any specifics." David nodded, his expression turning serious. "I understand. It was a long time ago, and you were probably just a fleeting figure in my life. But what you did back then had a lasting impact on me. I can explain more fully if you're willing to listen." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Please go ahead." David took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for the weight of his memories. "It was about 15 years ago. I was working as a janitor at one of your company's properties. It was a tough time for me. My wife had recently passed away, and I was struggling to provide for my young daughter. I felt as if I was sinking into a pit with no way out." Alexander listened intently, the gravity of David's words beginning to resonate with him. He had heard stories of hardship before, but this was different. It was personal, and it was directly tied to him. "One day," David continued, "I was cleaning the lobby of one of your office buildings when you walked in. I recognized you, of course. Everyone in the city knew who you were. But I was just a janitor, a faceless worker. I never imagined you would even notice me." Alexander's mind raced as he tried to recall the specifics. The memory was elusive, a shadow of something he had seen or heard about, but not something he could clearly define. "You must have seen something in me," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "You stopped and spoke to me. You asked me about my life, my struggles. I was surprised by your kindness. You were not just a powerful businessman, but someone who seemed genuinely concerned." Alexander's brow furrowed. "I don't remember the conversation, but I do recall making a point to speak to employees from time to time. I suppose I must have said something encouraging." David nodded. "That's right. You offered me a small loan, no questions asked. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help me get back on my feet. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just gave me a chance." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "And you used that loan to start your own business?" "Yes," David said, his voice gaining strength. "I used the money to buy tools and materials for a repair shop. It was a humble beginning, but it allowed me to provide for my daughter and eventually grow the business. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And over time, that small act of kindness turned into something much bigger. It became a symbol of hope for me." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been driven by results and achievements, often forgetting the personal impact of his actions. Hearing David's story, he was confronted with a side of his own influence that he had largely ignored. "You kept my picture as a reminder?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now. David nodded. "Yes. I kept it in my wallet as a reminder of that moment when someone saw beyond my circumstances and believed in me. It was a symbol of hope, of the idea that even in the darkest times, there is a possibility for change. It helped me remember that no matter how high I climbed, I should never forget where I came from. Alexander sat back, absorbing the weight of David's words. The room felt smaller now, the air thicker with the unspoken emotions that had been laid bare. It was a moment of profound realization, a reminder of the power of small acts of kindness and their ripple effects through people's lives. David's voice broke the silence. I never expected to see you again, Mr. Gray. I thought that chapter of my life was closed. But when Emma mentioned the picture last night, I realized I had to tell you. I wanted you to know that you made a difference. Alexander's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The realization that he had touched someone's life so profoundly, without even being aware of it, was both humbling and inspiring. It made him reevaluate his own approach to his responsibilities and the legacy he wished to leave behind. Thank you for sharing this with me, Alexander said finally. I didn't realize the impact of my actions back then. It's enlightening to see the long-term effects of even small gestures. David looked at him with gratitude in his eyes. It was important for me to tell you, and I hope it brings you some understanding of the difference you've made. They sat in silence for a moment, both men reflecting on the weight of the conversation. For Alexander, it was a rare moment of vulnerability, a glimpse into a part of his life that had remained hidden behind the facade of success and control. Finally, Alexander stood up, extending his hand once more to David. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. I appreciate your openness and the opportunity to understand this part of my past. David shook his hand firmly. Thank you for listening, Mr. Gray. It means more than you know. As Alexander left David's modest home, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter had given him a new perspective on his own life and the broader impact of his actions. It was a reminder that behind every successful venture and every business deal, there were people whose lives were shaped by the choices made at the top. Driving back through the city, Alexander felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The answers he had sought had been found, but more importantly, he had gained a deeper understanding of the human connections that bound people together. The past was no longer just a distant memory, but a living, breathing part of his present reality. And with that newfound understanding, Alexander Gray could look forward with a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. The city outside Alexander Gray's office window was bustling with the usual frenzy of urban life. But inside his high-rise sanctuary, the atmosphere was one of deep contemplation. The grand office, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and elegant furnishings, had always been a space where Alexander could focus on his work and make decisions that influenced the course of his empire. Yet today, it felt different, a cocoon of calm amidst the swirling storm of his thoughts. Alexander sat behind his desk, staring at the intricate patterns of the city below. The skyscrapers seemed like silent witnesses to his internal struggle, their steel and glass facades reflecting the afternoon sun in a way that made him think of the myriad reflections of his own life. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous day, the conversation with David Carter, the emotional weight of their exchange, and the profound realization that had followed. The impact of David's story had shaken Alexander more than he cared to admit. It was one thing to hear about the effects of your actions from a distance, in reports or accolades. It was entirely another to be confronted with the real-life consequences, the human faces that had been touched by seemingly small gestures made years ago. Alexander had always prided himself on his ability to control outcomes, but this experience had forced him to confront the unpredictability of human connections. As he sat there, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his executive assistant, Sarah, a woman known for her efficiency and professionalism. She entered the room with a stack of files, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Gray," she began, "I have the quarterly reports and some documents that need your review. Is now a good time?" Alexander turned his gaze from the window, his mind still occupied with the weight of the previous day. He nodded absently, taking the files from Sarah's hands. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll look at these shortly. Could you give me a moment alone?" Sarah nodded and exited the room, closing the door gently behind her. Alexander glanced at the stack of reports on his desk, but found it difficult to concentrate on the figures and data that had once been his primary focus. His thoughts kept circling back to David Carter's story, the image of the man's gratitude, and the symbolic power of that small, old photograph. With a sigh, Alexander pushed the reports aside and reached for his phone. He needed to talk to someone, to gain a different perspective on what he was experiencing. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, a number for someone who had once been a close confidant, a mentor of sorts, but with whom he had lost touch as his career had taken over his life. The phone rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Alexander. It's been a long time." "Hello, Evelyn," Alexander replied, his tone both warm and hesitant. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" Alexander took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I'm dealing with something unexpected. I need your advice. Could we meet?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course. How about we meet at the cafe we used to go to? I'll be there in an hour." The call ended, and Alexander felt a small sense of relief. Evelyn Thompson had been a mentor and a friend, someone who had helped him navigate the complexities of his early career. She had always been a voice of reason, and he hoped she would provide the clarity he needed now. An hour later, Alexander found himself in the same quaint cafe where he and Evelyn had shared many conversations over the years. The place had a cozy, almost nostalgic charm to it, with its rustic wooden tables and soft, ambient lighting. Alexander spotted Evelyn at a corner table, her silver hair neatly styled and her eyes as perceptive as ever. "Evelyn," Alexander greeted, offering a genuine smile as he approached the table. "Alexander," she responded, standing to give him a warm hug. "It's good to see you." They both settled into their seats, and Evelyn signaled for a server to bring them coffee. Once they were alone, Evelyn looked at Alexander with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone encouraging. Alexander hesitated for a moment before diving into the story. He recounted the events of the previous evening, the encounter with Emma, David Carter's emotional revelation, and the unexpected impact it had had on him. Evelyn listened intently, her expression shifting between sympathy and contemplation as Alexander spoke. When he finished, Evelyn took a moment to collect her thoughts before responding. "It sounds like you've had quite an experience. It's not every day that one confronts the direct consequences of their actions, especially when those actions are from the distant past." Alexander nodded. "Exactly. I've always been focused on the future, on achieving more and controlling outcomes. But it's made me question everything I thought I knew about the impact of my actions." Evelyn sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "It's natural to feel that way. When we're in the midst of our successes and challenges, we often don't see the broader picture. We're so focused on our immediate goals that we forget how our actions ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand." "It's unsettling," Alexander admitted. "I've always prided myself on my ability to steer the course of my career, to shape the future. But now, it feels like I'm being reminded of a side of my influence that's beyond my control." Evelyn smiled gently. "And that's the beauty of it. The fact that you're feeling unsettled shows that you're growing, evolving. It's easy to become complacent when everything is going according to plan. But moments like these, moments when we're faced with the real human consequences of our actions, can be transformative." Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing Evelyn's words. "So, what do you suggest I do with this newfound awareness?" Evelyn's eyes twinkled with insight. "Embrace it. Use it as a guide for your future decisions. Your influence has always been significant, but now you have a deeper understanding of its impact. Let this experience remind you of the importance of empathy, of seeing beyond the immediate results and considering the broader effects of your actions." The server arrived with their coffee, and Evelyn took a sip before continuing. "And remember, Alexander, it's not about changing who you are or abandoning your goals. It's about integrating this new perspective into your approach. Use it to enhance your leadership, to inspire those around you, and to make decisions that not only advance your objectives but also positively impact those you encounter." Alexander considered Evelyn's advice carefully. It was clear that this experience had shifted his perspective in profound ways. He had always been driven by results and efficiency, but now he saw the importance of balancing that drive with a deeper sense of empathy and understanding. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said sincerely. "Your insights are exactly what I needed. I think I'm beginning to understand how to integrate this new perspective into my life and work." Evelyn smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes, it takes an unexpected experience to remind us of the fundamental truths we often overlook. Embrace this change and let it guide you." As they continued their conversation, discussing various aspects of Alexander's career and personal life, he felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. Evelyn's guidance had provided him with a framework for how to move forward, and he was determined to apply this newfound awareness to both his professional endeavors and his interactions with others. By the time their meeting concluded, Alexander felt a sense of resolution. The past had not only been a source of unexpected revelations, but also a catalyst for personal growth. He left the cafe with a clear sense of direction, ready to embrace the lessons he had learned and apply them to his future endeavors. As he returned to his office, the city's energy seemed to buzz with renewed possibilities. Alexander's perspective had shifted, and he was eager to see how this new understanding would shape his approach to leadership and influence. The journey that had begun with a child's innocent words had led him to a deeper appreciation of the human connections that formed the foundation of his success. And with that realization, Alexander Gray was ready to face the future with a renewed sense of purpose and empathy. The bright lights of the cityscape were slowly dimming as evening approached, casting a soft golden hue across the skyline. The charity gala, a glittering affair that had drawn the city's elite, was in full swing at the grandiose ballroom of the city's most opulent hotel. The room buzzed with conversation and the clinking of glasses as guests mingled, their laughter and chatter creating a lively symphony of social interaction. Alexander Gray, the billionaire businessman whose presence was often the highlight of such events, was among the attendees. However, tonight, he was not the same Alexander who had always reveled in the power and prestige that came with his status. The encounter with David Carter and the unexpected revelations of the previous day had left him introspective, and the usual allure of the gala seemed muted against the backdrop of his recent epiphanies. As Alexander surveyed the room from his vantage point near the bar, his mind was occupied with the significant shift in his perspective. The interaction with David had been transformative, leading him to reconsider the true nature of success and influence. What had been a night of glamour and celebration now felt like a stage upon which he was expected to perform a role he no longer felt entirely comfortable with. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Emma Carter standing there, her small figure looking both out of place and oddly fitting in the sophisticated environment. She was accompanied by her father, David, who stood a few steps behind her, a nervous smile on his face. "Mr. Gray," Emma said, her voice clear and confident despite her young age. "Can we talk for a moment?" Alexander, taken aback by the request, nodded and gestured for them to follow him to a quieter corner of the ballroom. The hustle and bustle of the gala seemed to recede as they moved away from the crowd, leaving them in a more intimate setting. Once they were settled, Alexander looked at Emma with curiosity. "What is it, Emma?" Emma's eyes were earnest as she spoke. "I wanted to tell you something. Last night, when I said I knew you because of the picture in Daddy's wallet, it wasn't just a random fact. It's been a big part of our lives. That picture is more than just a photo. It's a symbol of how one person's kindness can make a big difference." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He had heard David's story, but hearing it from Emma, a child who had been a part of this journey, added a new layer of poignancy to the tale. The way she spoke about the photograph with such reverence and understanding was a reminder of the profound impact even small gestures could have. "Emma," Alexander said softly, "I didn't realize how much that small act had meant. It's amazing to hear it from you, to see how it's been a part of your family's story." Emma nodded, her face glowing with the seriousness of the moment. "Daddy always said that you helped us when we needed it the most. And now, we're here to tell you that you've always been important to us, even if you didn't know it." David stepped forward, his eyes filled with gratitude and a hint of sadness. "Mr. Gray, I wanted to thank you again, not just for the help you gave us, but for how it inspired Emma and me. It changed our lives in ways I couldn't have anticipated." Alexander, moved by their words, took a deep breath. David, Emma, you've given me more than you realize. Your story has shown me that the impact of our actions extends far beyond what we see. It's a lesson I needed to learn, and I'm deeply grateful for it. There was a moment of silence as the weight of the conversation settled over them. The gala's music played softly in the background, a distant reminder of the world outside their intimate conversation. I've been thinking a lot lately about the future, Alexander continued, his voice steady. And I realize now that it's not just about achieving more or expanding my business. It's about using the influence I have to make a positive difference, just as you've shown me. Emma's eyes sparkled with hope. That's really nice to hear, Mr. Gray. I think it's important that everyone remembers how much their actions can matter. David nodded in agreement. Absolutely. And if you ever need reminders or stories of how small acts can lead to big changes, you know where to find us. The conversation was poignant, yet filled with a sense of closure and new beginnings. Alexander felt a deep sense of connection with David and Emma, a bond forged through a shared understanding of the human impact of kindness and generosity. As the evening wore on, Alexander, David, and Emma remained in the quieter part of the ballroom, talking about their lives and the future. The gala continued around them, a whirl of colors and sounds, but for Alexander, it had become a backdrop to a more meaningful experience. The connections he made that night would not be measured in business deals or social status, but in the profound impact of human relationships. When it was time for David and Emma to leave, Alexander walked with them to the exit, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. They said their goodbyes with genuine warmth, and as Alexander watched them depart, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Back in the bustling ballroom, Alexander took a moment to reflect on the evening's events. The glamour and excitement of the gala were still there, but they had taken on a new dimension. He had come to understand that true success wasn't just about financial achievements or personal accolades. It was about the difference one could make in the lives of others. As he rejoined the crowd, Alexander felt a shift within himself. The lessons he had learned from David and Emma were now guiding his thoughts and actions. He was no longer just a businessman navigating the world of high stakes and power. He was someone who had been reminded of the importance of empathy, kindness, and the profound impact of even the smallest gestures. The night continued with its usual events, dinner, speeches, and dancing. But for Alexander, it was a different kind of celebration. It was a celebration of understanding, of growth, and of the connections that truly mattered. As he mingled with the other guests, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to making a difference in the world. The gala, which had started as a glittering social event, had become a milestone in Alexander's life. It was a reminder of the power of human connection and the importance of using one's influence for good. And as the night drew to a close, Alexander Gray knew that he would leave with more than just memories of an elegant affair. He would leave with a deeper appreciation for the impact of his actions and a commitment to making a positive difference in the lives of those around him.